What would it take for a woman to challenge the greatest empire in the world? For Queen Boudica, all it took was betrayal. Her family attacked, her kingdom humiliated, and her people treated as slaves. Rome's arrogance pushed her to the brink. But she didn't break. Instead, she rallied tribes who had feuded for generations, forged an alliance through sheer will, and unleashed a rebellion that shattered Roman cities and choked their roads with destruction. How could one woman lead an uprising so massive it almost drove Rome out of Britain? This is the story of Boudica's fiery revenge. Camulodunum was the jewel of Roman Britain, the first officially established colony in the province, and a proud symbol of Roman authority. Its streets were laid out in orderly grids, its buildings boasted all the hallmarks of Roman engineering, and its crowning feature, the Temple of Claudius, loomed large over the city. Built to honor the late emperor who had led the conquest of Britain, the temple stood as a constant reminder of Rome's domination. But to the local Britons, it was a monument to their humiliation. They had been forced to finance its construction through crushing taxes, even as they watched their ancestral lands shrink under the Roman settlers' occupation. The resentment brewing beneath the surface of Roman Britain found its breaking point in Camulodunum, and Boudica was the one to ignite it. The Romans stationed in the city believed they were secure. After all, Camulodunum was guarded by veterans, seasoned soldiers who had retired from active duty but were still thought sufficient to protect a city this vital to the empire. What they lacked in youth, they made up for, or so Rome thought, in experience and loyalty. But experience would mean little against what came next. When word first reached the city of unrest among the tribes, it was dismissed as noise from the distant outskirts. By the time accurate reports arrived that a rebellion had begun, it wasn't just any rebellion, but one led by the Queen of the Iceni. They had no time left to prepare. Boudica's forces descended on Camulodunum without mercy. The rebellion didn't bring a conventional army. It brought tribes with a generational hatred for Rome and everything it stood for. The battle wasn't just about defeating the enemy, it became a statement of destruction. Homes, markets, administrative buildings, all were engulfed in flames. The veterans who had been tasked with guarding the city were outnumbered and utterly unprepared for the onslaught. They were slaughtered along with the civilians who had sought safety behind the city's walls, a safety that, in reality, didn't exist. The Temple of Claudius, meant to be a testament to Rome's eternal might, became a grim final refuge. Roman civilians fled there as the fires raged through the city, barricading themselves within the massive stone walls. But it wasn't enough. Boudica's forces tore through the defenses and brought the temple crashing down. Piece by piece, they dismantled what had once stood as a symbol of unshakable power. Survivors later described the aftermath as not just destruction, but carnage steeped in ritual. Some of the captured Romans were reportedly crucified or drowned in nearby lakes, their deaths offerings to the Celtic gods. The annihilation of Camulodunum was more than a military victory. It was psychological warfare at its most effective. News of the city's destruction reached Roman Britain's other settlements, then traveled all the way to Rome itself. For an empire that prided itself on almost mythological invulnerability, the scale of the loss shook its core. Even Emperor Nero, described by Roman historians as the man often indifferent to distant provinces, briefly contemplated abandoning Britain altogether. The Senate debated the practicality of holding on to a far-flung territory that had erupted in such vehement resistance. The scorched earth at Camulodunum was still smoldering when Boudica turned her attention to the next target. This revolt was not simply a series of skirmishes, it was a calculated campaign of speed and destruction, meant to strike before Rome could process what was happening, let alone respond. The next city in the path of the uprising was Londinium, a rapidly growing settlement on the banks of the Thames. It wasn't yet the expansive city we think of today, but even then, Londinium was a bustling hub of trade, administration, and Roman infrastructure, a critical nerve center in the province. And yet, for all its importance, it was defenseless, left exposed and vulnerable. At the time, the Roman governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was stationed in Wales, conducting a campaign against the Druids on the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey. His forces were too far west to intervene, and the news of Camulodunum's annihilation had reached him far too late. He had no time to assemble reinforcements to save Londinium. Recognizing the strategic disadvantage, Suetonius made a decision that would go down as one of the darkest chapters in the province's history. He abandoned Londinium. Seeing that the rebellion could not be confronted in time, Suetonius ordered a retreat, leaving the city's civilians, many of them Roman settlers or Romanized Britons, to fend for themselves. When Boudica's forces arrived, there was no resistance. What followed was catastrophic. Within hours, Londinium's streets became rivers of chaos. Shops, homes, and even administrative buildings were set alight as the city's population scrambled to escape. Boudica's forces didn't allow it. The rebels poured through the settlement like a tide, capturing or killing anyone who crossed their path. Archaeological evidence has uncovered a deep burn layer beneath modern London, a charred stratum that stands as physical proof of the devastation unleashed by Boudica's army. The layer is filled with melted pottery, scorched wooden beams, and debris, all remnants of the thriving Roman town reduced to ash. Historians from the Roman perspective, such as Tacitus, paint a grim picture of the aftermath. According to his accounts, tens of thousands, men, women, children, were slaughtered. The rebels targeted Roman bureaucrats, settlers, and even Britons who had integrated into Roman society. To Boudica and her followers, these individuals represented betrayal, either for their role in enforcing Roman oppression or for disregarding their tribal heritage. It's believed that there was little distinction between combatants and civilians in the eyes of the rebellion. Every person bearing markers of Roman influence became a target. The attack on Londinium was so swift and thorough that Roman scouts initially misreported the incident. They believed the settlement had been devastated by an earthquake or some other natural disaster. The notion that a tribal force, worse yet, one led by a woman, could execute such widespread destruction defied belief. Roman intelligence simply could not comprehend what was taking shape in Britannia. Boudica's assault wasn't just physical, it was also symbolic. Londinium was a center of Roman administration, a city where records were kept, trade routes were managed, and taxes were collected. Burning it to the ground wasn't simply an act of revenge, it was a deliberate effort to destabilize Roman control over Britannia. By razing Londinium, Boudica aimed at the administrative heart of the province, erasing records and disrupting the machinery of occupation. By this time, fear was spreading as rapidly as the rebellion itself. Many in Rome, upon hearing of Londinium's fate, began to see the uprising less as a localized disturbance and more as an existential threat to their presence in Britain. Tales of the rebellion carried whispers of horror. A woman had done what Hannibal could not. The shock to Roman pride was profound. A tribal force, united by shared despair and wrath, had operated with an effectiveness Rome never thought them capable of. Worse still, their leader, a queen stripped of her dignity and her people's lands, was proving to be a tactician who understood not only vengeance, but strategy. With 2 cities destroyed and no response from Rome in sight, the rebellion moved forward. For Boudica, this was not a moment to pause. London was only phase 1 of a larger campaign. Even as the survivors scattered into the countryside, the flames of Londinium lit the path for what came next. The so-called raiders who upended Roman Britain weren't nameless outsiders storming across distant borders. They were Britons, people Rome had already claimed within its sprawling empire. But these weren't loyal subjects. They were newly united tribes who had suffered years of Roman oppression and saw Boudica as their leader. At the heart of this rebellion was the Iceni, Boudica's own tribe, who had once been Rome's allies. For years, they had maintained a delicate balance, trading loyalty for local autonomy. Everything changed when Roman leaders broke that agreement, seizing their lands and brutalizing their queen. The rebellion quickly drew support beyond the Iceni. The Trinovantes, another Celtic tribe, became Boudica's most critical ally. Their grievances mirrored the Iceni's: confiscated land, dishonored treaties, and the Roman settlers who not only took their homes but demanded heavy taxes to fund their own dominance. Among the Trinovantes, Rome's destruction of their sacred spaces was fresh in memory, particularly the temples that mirrored Roman gods while erasing their own. Other tribes began flocking to Boudica's cause as her campaign spread. Whispers of Roman families fleeing for safety turned into a rallying cry for freedom, drawing warriors, female and male, from across the province. By the height of the rebellion, this grassroots movement had grown into an estimated 100,000 strong. These weren't trained soldiers in the conventional sense. Unlike Rome's legions, this force followed no drill formation, carried no standardized gear, and marched to no single battle drum. But it wasn't chaos either. What the Britons lacked in formal discipline, they made up for in their intimate knowledge of their land, its ambush points, rivers, dense forests, and the Roman roads cutting through it all. They understood Rome's infrastructure because they had been forced to build it. Now, they turned that understanding against their oppressors, striking supply chains, overwhelming poorly garrisoned towns, and avoiding prolonged engagements that might favor the Roman tactics of order. The motivations that drove these raiders were complex, but unified by one central truth: cultural survival. Rome wasn't just taking land or demanding taxes, it was systematically dismantling their way of life. Tribal laws were undermined by Roman courts, while Celtic nobility saw their status evaporate in favor of foreign settlers. The spiritual heart of Celtic society, the Druids, faced annihilation as Roman governors targeted their sacred sites. What Boudica offered wasn't just vengeance, but the chance for Britons to fight for their gods, families, and traditions before they disappeared entirely. Among the warriors were those who had once fought for Rome as auxiliary soldiers. They brought with them knowledge of Roman tactics and defenses. Some, ironically, now mimicked the disciplined formations they had once served in to exploit Rome's arrogance. Boudica's rebels weren't simply a rampaging mob, as Roman historians later tried to portray them. They were an evolving force capable of adapting. Still, much of their strength came from their cultural cohesion. Celtic warriors carried distinctive weapons, often passed down through generations and decorated with symbolic engravings. They painted their bodies with woad, a blue dye believed to instill both fear in enemies and courage in themselves. Before battle, Druids blessed the warriors and invoked ancient gods, fusing spiritual purpose with battlefield strategy. The Iceni stood out for their chariot warfare. More mobile than infantry and capable of striking quickly, their chariots were symbols of prestige long before the rebellion began. It's important to note, too, that Celtic society granted women roles vastly different from those in Rome. While Roman matrons were confined to domestic life, British women could lead, inherit, and even fight. A Roman historian, likely surprised by what he saw, wrote that for the Britons, quote, "The Britons make no distinction of sex in matters of bravery." In Boudica, these warriors found a leader who embodied both defiance and tradition. This was a revolt built on rage but carried out with purpose. By asserting not only their military power but their cultural identity in every battle, Boudica's coalition upended the Roman narrative of untouchable greatness. These weren't just raiders, they were people fighting for their right to exist. As Boudica's forces swept across Roman Britain, little remained of the settlements in their path. Camulodunum had been obliterated, Londinium reduced to ash, and yet Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans, would be next to burn. For Rome, one question loomed over these fiery ruins. How could the empire's advanced military machine be so unprepared? Desperate messages were sent from Londinium and Verulamium as chaos unfolded, begging for reinforcements. But those reinforcements weren't coming. Rome's closest legions were either too far away or actively avoiding direct confrontation until the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, would gain the upper hand. Despite their pleas, the cities were abandoned to fend for themselves. Suetonius, fresh from his campaign against the Druids in Wales, returned to find the province unraveling. Though his forces had seen success at Mona, they were exhausted and too few in number to immediately confront the rebellion head-on. Worse still, Suetonius recognized the true scale of the problem. This was not an isolated uprising contained to a border region. Towns were falling in rapid succession. Refugees flooded Roman roads, choking key supply routes. Messages from the provinces painted the stark reality. If the rebellion wasn't stopped soon, Britain itself could be lost. And yet, to the people of the empire, nothing seemed amiss. Rome's governors enacted a near-total news blackout. The rebellion, they claimed in secret dispatches, was manageable. Publicly, they said nothing at all. This silence wasn't just a strategy, it was survival. Roman officials feared that knowledge of Britain's collapse could spark uprisings in other provinces, or worse, invite external threats. Empires functioned on the perception of power, and acknowledging that a provincial uprising led by a woman was overwhelming Roman ranks would damage more than morale. It would invite a disaster. There were no official decrees of the crisis sent to the Emperor Nero beyond basic updates, and no large-scale edicts for immediate reinforcements were ordered. Instead, local governors played a nervous waiting game. Outside of Britain, it was business as usual. In the cities and towns left to their own devices, confidence in Rome's ability to govern evaporated. Londinium's wealthiest citizens began hiding their treasures, cash, jewelry, statues, whatever they could, often in shallow pits or wells beneath the ground. Archaeologists have uncovered hoards from this period, buried in such haste that they are thought to have been left behind entirely as owners fled. For the elite who remained, the realization hit hard. Rome's grip on Britain wasn't as strong as they'd believed. Verulamium, for instance, sat at what seemed to be a critical intersection of Roman infrastructure, but its defenders were non-existent. Despite the might of Rome's empire, ordinary citizens were learning firsthand how fragile that power really was. The chaos sparked gestures of desperation. Roman officials began destroying their own census records, fearing that they could be used by Boudica's forces as tools for tracking tax collectors or identifying loyalists. Personal records, receipts, and inventories of Roman wealth likely suffered the same fate, as entire towns burned by both rebel fire and official actions. It was a type of scorched earth approach, though instead of targeting the enemy, the Romans were erasing anything that could be used against them. Panic wasn't just in the streets of Verulamium or in the flow of refugees. Rome itself appeared to be on the edge of panic, though it masked it well. Britannia, generally seen as an expendable periphery province, was suddenly pivotal because its loss would undermine everything. The fact that it was a woman who had devastated 3 cities, one after the other, turned the rebellion into an almost unthinkable reality. For centuries, the Roman Empire had referred to itself as unshakable, its territories sculpted by the hand of Mars himself. Now, the streets outside of Rome were echoing with questions about its northern frontier and rumors about the queen who had dared to fight back. Still, despite this crumbling facade, there was no formal acknowledgement of the rebellion's success. Rome held on to its silence, knowing that rebellion was bigger than Britannia. To admit that a tribal queen was winning would change history in real time. For Rome, silence became its last weapon. But even that couldn't outdo the growing truth. A woman had struck where no emperor had thought possible, and Britannia, for all its distance from the empire's heart, exposed just how vulnerable Rome truly was. The Iceni kingdom, tucked away in the flatlands of what is now Norfolk, rarely drew Rome's attention in its early days of occupation. It wasn't Germania, with its dense forests and warring tribes, nor Gaul, where political intrigue and military campaigns were routine. It wasn't even Britannia's own rebellious west, home to the Druids and their sacred stronghold on Mona. By comparison, the Iceni seemed cooperative, pragmatic allies content to maintain their tribal independence under the empire's watchful eye. Their king, Prasutagus, ruled as a client king, a status that allowed him to govern his people as long as he paid tribute to Rome and aligned himself with its interests. For years, this arrangement held, with the Iceni trading their loyalty for peace and prosperity. Prasutagus took his role as a mediator seriously, even attempting to ensure stability after his death. When he died, likely around 60 CE, he left behind a carefully crafted will. In a gesture meant to appease both the Iceni and their Roman overlords, he named the emperor as one of his heirs alongside his two daughters. This decision was a diplomatic gamble, aimed at protecting his family and maintaining his kingdom's relative autonomy. But Rome saw it differently. Instead of respecting the will, Roman officials viewed it as an insult, a presumption that a tribal leader could dictate terms to the empire. To them, the Iceni were not partners, but subjects, and their lands and wealth were now Rome's to claim. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Roman officials invaded the Iceni court, confiscating lands and stripping the nobility of their privileges. Boudica, Prasutagus' widow, was publicly flogged, a humiliating act meant to break her spirit and send a clear message. Her daughters suffered even worse, subjected to violence so unspeakable that Roman sources only allude to it indirectly. More than just an insult to the family, these actions struck at the very heart of the Iceni's identity. Tribal leaders who had once supported the Roman alliance now saw their homeland treated like spoils of war. In a single generation, the Iceni had gone from allies to victims of Rome's unchecked ambition. But the kingdom Rome had dismissed as insignificant held more power than the empire realized. The Iceni were not isolated farmers dependent on Roman trade. They were a wealthy and resourceful people. Their prosperity came from fertile lands ideal for agriculture, as well as rich deposits of metals that had fostered a thriving industry. The Iceni were skilled metallurgists who had long produced weapons, jewelry, and tools. These resources, combined with their growing resentment, provided the foundation for what would become Boudica's rebellion. While the Western Druids remained Rome's primary focus, the Iceni were steadily amassing a devastating coalition in the east. Their previous alliance with Rome had given them an understanding of the empire's systems. Knowledge now turned against it. The Iceni were crucial to inspiring nearby tribes to join the revolt, particularly the Trinovantes, who shared a similar history of betrayal. By the time Londinium felt the flames of rebellion, the forgotten kingdom of the Iceni had become the epicenter of a movement that threatened to erase Rome's hold on Britain. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the name Iceni virtually disappeared from Roman records. Scholars today suspect the omission wasn't accidental. Rome, ever mindful of its image, likely erased references to the very people who had exposed its vulnerabilities. Yet the impact of the rebellion proved something undeniable. Rome's system of client kingdoms, designed to ensure control through cooperation, could collapse into chaos when the empire pushed too far. From this small, overlooked kingdom in the east rose the revolt that almost drove Rome out of Britain altogether. Boudica's journey to rebellion didn't start on the battlefield. It began years earlier, sealed in a marriage meant to balance peace and power. She was married to Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, whose rule depended on an uneasy alliance with Rome. As a client king, Prasutagus was allowed to govern his people under Roman oversight, provided he followed a few key conditions. He had to enforce Roman law, pay heavy tribute, and maintain order. In exchange, Rome agreed to leave his kingdom largely autonomous. It was an arrangement built on domination masked as diplomacy. But the Iceni didn't rule the way Romans understood power. For Rome, kings were supreme, and queens, at best, existed only to produce heirs. In Celtic society, however, power was often shared, and women could hold influence equal to their male counterparts. Boudica didn't sit quietly as a queen consort. She was a co-ruler alongside her husband. To the Romans, this was unusual, even unsettling. Their empire had little context for a world where women could lead warriors, shape laws, and command tribal loyalty. What seemed to Rome to be a cultural peculiarity was one of the Iceni's greatest strengths, a cultural contrast that would eventually push them to war. Prasutagus, despite these differences, tried to secure stability. Near the end of his life, knowing Roman annexation loomed if he didn't act, he made a decision that balanced diplomacy with family loyalty. His will declared Emperor Nero and his daughters as joint heirs to his kingdom, a move intended to appease Rome while securing a future for his household. On paper, it was a gesture of loyalty. In reality, it came attached to a silent plea: let the Iceni keep their land. However, it wasn't taken this way. Roman authorities, dismissive of a tribal king's attempts to dictate terms, invalidated the will outright. Prasutagus' death signaled not a transition of power under his terms, but the complete absorption of Iceni lands into the Roman Empire. What happened next was a violation on every cultural and personal level imaginable. Boudica protested the Roman annexation openly, asserting her daughter's rights to inherit by Iceni law. Her objections were met with a ruthless display of power to crush dissent and show dominance. Roman officials ransacked the royal household, stripped the Iceni nobles of property, and seized wealth to fund their expanding empire. Boudica herself was publicly flogged, a violent act meant not just to punish, but to humiliate. What happened to her daughters was worse. They were sexually assaulted, a calculated degradation designed to erase their futures as leaders and fracture royal authority among the Iceni. This wasn't just an attack on a family or a royal line. It struck at the heart of Iceni identity. Celtic societies often passed inheritance through female bloodlines, a concept alien to Roman law. When Rome disregarded Boudica's daughters and denied their succession, it wasn't simply administrative theft. It dismantled a cultural foundation. To the Iceni, this wasn't just legal manipulation, it was an act of war. Boudica's transformation from queen to avenger didn't happen in a single moment, but this was the catalyst. She emerged from these events not just as a leader grieving her family's destruction, but as the face of widespread rage against Roman oppression. Ironically, Rome had used marriage alliances across its provinces to domesticate tribal leaders for centuries. It was supposed to be the mechanism that integrated local rulers into the empire's hierarchy, binding them to Roman interests. Instead, this particular alliance created a threat unlike anything Rome had prepared for. They had stripped Boudica of her title, her land, and her dignity. In her fury, they had forged the leader who would strike fear into the empire itself. When King Prasutagus of the Iceni died, his final act was meant to preserve his kingdom's fragile autonomy. His will named both Emperor Nero and his daughters as heirs, a decision that reflected careful political calculation. By including Nero, he aimed to show loyalty to Rome while protecting his lineage under Celtic tradition, which allowed daughters to inherit power and land. But what Prasutagus viewed as a diplomatic safeguard, Rome saw as a provocation. To the empire, rulership was not something to be shared and certainly not passed to women. Roman law recognized only imperial authority and a system of male succession. The idea that a tribal king would dare to dictate inheritance outside of Roman norms was, to them, unacceptable. Rather than respect the will, Roman administrators invalidated it entirely. They declared the Iceni lands fully annexed into the province and treated Prasutagus' death not as a transition, but as an opportunity for conquest. Roman officials descended on Iceni territory, stripping the nobility of their lands and confiscating wealth to fill provincial coffers. What had been a kingdom under nominal control became a Roman possession overnight. Yet this was not merely about land or resources, it was symbolic. By rejecting Prasutagus' will, Rome signaled that native customs, no matter how diplomatically framed, held no weight when they clashed with imperial authority. For the Iceni, this was more than an administrative takeover. It was cultural erasure. Celtic societies thrived on deeply rooted traditions, including the idea that leadership could pass through female lines. By denying the inheritance of Prasutagus' daughters, Rome not only ignored these customs, but humiliated an entire kingdom. The rejection of the will made it clear. Their sovereignty, rights, and laws carried no meaning under Rome's rule. At the center of this outrage was Boudica, widow of Prasutagus and co-ruler of the Iceni. When she protested Rome's actions, she was met with unrelenting violence. She was publicly flogged, her daughters subjected to brutal assault, and her family's wealth seized. To the Iceni, this was not governance, it was an act of war. The consequences of this legal betrayal didn't end with the Iceni. Neighboring tribes, many of whom had their own grievances against Rome, viewed the violation of Prasutagus' will as a warning. If even allies who played by Rome's rules could be so easily dismissed, what future did they have? Quietly, they began to mobilize behind Boudica. Her personal humiliation became a rallying cry, turning the annexation of the Iceni into the starting point of a revolt that would upend Roman Britain. Prasutagus' will, designed as an olive branch, instead became a battle flag. Rome's rigid legal system played a key role in escalating the crisis. While it served as the foundation for the empire's authority, here it exposed a dangerous blind spot. By treating Celtic law as irrelevant and refusing compromise, Roman officials deepened the divide between the Iceni and the empire. What to the Romans seemed like a clear assertion of power was, to the Britons, proof of their oppressors' indifference toward native dignity and tradition. Far from securing peace, their dismissal of the will proved how brittle Rome's alliances really were. Some historians have even questioned whether Prasutagus anticipated this outcome. It is possible, they suggest, that the will was a calculated move, written to test Rome's willingness to respect ceremonial agreements or to deliberately highlight the empire's lack of respect for regional customs. If that was the case, Prasutagus' final act was not simply a failure, it was the spark that ignited chaos. Whether intentional or not, this one document pushed Britain into open rebellion and revealed the fragile underpinnings of Rome's provincial control. Boudica's uprising, in many ways, can be traced back to this singular moment. The rejection of the will encapsulated the empire's larger disrespect for the cultures it subjugated, and the brutal retaliation against her family embodied everything that Rome's subjects came to hate. What began as a legal challenge over inheritance had become a catalyst for one of the largest insurrections the empire had ever faced. Through one denied agreement, the Iceni and their allies discovered the breaking point of Roman domination and found their reason to resist. After Prasutagus' death, Rome's response to the Iceni was relentless. His carefully crafted will, meant to appease both the empire and his daughters, was ignored. The annexation of Iceni lands wasn't a quiet bureaucratic maneuver. It came with the boots of Roman soldiers enforcing their claim. They tore through the Iceni's holdings, stripping the nobility of their wealth and pillaging the royal household. What followed was not merely an assertion of control, but a deliberate assault on a culture and a queen. Boudica, who openly resisted the seizure, was taken and publicly flogged. In Roman practice, flogging was a punishment reserved for slaves and petty criminals. To subject a reigning queen to such treatment was an intentional and brutal humiliation, a display of dominance by officials who saw the Iceni as little more than unruly subjects. The worst horror, however, was inflicted on Boudica's daughters. The young princesses, whose exact ages remain uncertain but were likely adolescents, were raped by Roman soldiers. This wasn't just an act of violence, it was a political message. By attacking the heirs of the Iceni throne, Rome didn't just harm Boudica's family, they desecrated the royal lineage that Celtic tribes held sacred. In Celtic tradition, rulers were seen as representatives not just of their people, but of the gods and the land itself. Violating Boudica's daughters wasn't an isolated incident. It was blasphemy that shattered tribal loyalties to Rome across Britain. Even by the standards of Roman warfare, this was considered extreme. Later accounts from Roman historians, who often sought to downplay the empire's darker moments, condemned the soldiers' actions in this case. Tacitus, known for his sober style, wrote that the treatment of Boudica and her family was excessive and deeply unjust, a rare admission from a Roman narrative. What made this event even more significant was that these acts were not carried out by renegade troops acting on impulse. They were authorized by Roman administrators, part of an overarching policy to crush dissent swiftly and completely. Roman officials viewed Boudica's resistance as insolence, not as the rightful outrage of a sovereign ruler. In their eyes, the flogging and assaults weren't atrocities, they were corrections. A woman who dared challenge imperial authority needed to be silenced, and her daughters could be used to make an example of the Iceni's failure to submit. For Rome, it was another calculated move to consolidate their power in a corner of the empire they saw as unruly. For the Britons, it was the ultimate betrayal. Words of these atrocities spread rapidly. Messengers carried news of what had happened not just to nearby tribes, but across the wider Celtic world. At gatherings, Druids and tribal leaders recounted the story of Boudica's humiliation and her daughter's suffering. It wasn't just gossip, it was a rallying cry. The treatment of Boudica became a symbol of everything Rome had done to erode the Celtic way of life. What began as whispers soon became pledges of allegiance. For tribes unsure of whether to join the revolt, this story clarified the stakes. Boudica's family wasn't just an isolated target. What happened to them could and would happen to any leader or tribe that dared defy Rome. The rebellion gained momentum like never before, with expressions of solidarity turning rivals into allies. For Boudica, this wasn't merely personal. As a mother, she sought justice for her daughters. As a queen, she sought justice for her people. Her cause grew within her and within others as an act not of desperation, but of dignity. The flogging and assaults became proof that there was no longer any option for coexistence with Rome. The tribes who had joined her later recounted their decision as one based on survival. Rome had shown its hand, and the choice was clear: submission or resistance. History often speaks of leaders who unite through charisma or vision, but Boudica's unification of the British tribes came from something far simpler: outrage. Rome's violence against her had ripped away not just her crown, but any illusions the tribes might have held about collaboration under imperial rule. The rebellion transformed from an act of vengeance into a collective movement for autonomy. Even centuries later, Roman historians like Cassius Dio revisited her story with an air of unease, knowing full well how close she came to razing Rome's northern frontier. What began with Boudica's flogging ended in one of the largest insurrections Rome had ever faced, led by a queen who had already lost everything. Rome believed that after their public flogging of Boudica and the assault of her daughters, she would fade into silence. Their actions were calculated to crush her spirit and ensure no challenge would emerge from her or her people. They assumed humiliation would break her, render her powerless, and serve as a warning to others. But Rome had completely misjudged the woman they had attacked. Instead of bending, Boudica rose. She turned her anger into leadership and vengeance, growing into the symbol her people needed: a queen who would fight back against an empire that thought itself untouchable. Boudica wasn't content to act as a mere figurehead. She commanded warriors, led marches, and gave rousing speeches that captured the hearts of an increasingly united tribal force. In a society that already respected women as leaders and warriors, Boudica took her place at the front lines with natural authority. But it was more than her tactical presence that inspired tribal loyalty. To her people, she wasn't just a resistance leader, she was a figure of destiny, a sacred avenger chosen by the gods to defend Celtic ways of life. For the tribes who joined her, their allegiance to Boudica wasn't purely political, it was deeply spiritual. Roman sources painted a vivid picture of Boudica, though their descriptions were written with fear and disbelief. They describe her as towering, with a commanding gaze and a mass of fiery red hair cascading past her waist. Her voice was said to be sharp and almost otherworldly, fueling the impression that she embodied both mortal and divine rage. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts underline the psychological power she wielded, not just over her own people, but over her enemies. Roman soldiers, trained to feel nothing but contempt for women, now found themselves shaken by the presence of this tall, unyielding figure who seemed to carry the fury of an entire people. What Rome hadn't anticipated was that their brutal treatment of Boudica had transformed her into precisely the type of leader who could achieve what had seemed impossible: unity among Britain's often fragmented tribes. Long-standing feuds and rivalries fell to the wayside, replaced by a common cause rooted in shared rage, cultural pride, and survival. Rome's attempt to reduce her to nothing had instead forged what they feared most: someone who could turn scattered provincial resentment into a full-scale rebellion capable of challenging their dominance. Her rebellion was more than a cry for justice. It was a calculated rejection of everything Rome had forced upon her people. She rallied the tribes not just around her personal pain, but around the idea that Celtic culture itself was worth protecting. Boudica's war campaigns showed an awareness of Roman weaknesses, targeting their infrastructure, supply networks, and settlements with devastating precision. Riding in her chariot, her daughters beside her, she became the most visible symbol of defiance. Their presence was deliberate. Together, they embodied resilience and resistance, a family that Rome had tried to destroy, yet couldn't erase. Even Roman generals, confident in their tactics and experience, faltered in the face of her rebellion's scale. The uncertainty she created ran so deep that some military records refused to name her directly, referring only to the woman or the tribal leader. To the empire, saying her name was to acknowledge her power, an acknowledgement they could not risk. Yet Boudica didn't need their acknowledgement. Her actions spoke for her. Rome had aimed to break her completely, but all they managed was the creation of a queen who would leave their legions reeling, her legend outlasting their attempted suppression. In Celtic Britain, women held roles that would have been unthinkable in Rome. They were leaders, warriors, property owners, and even spiritual authorities, woven into the very fabric of tribal politics and religious life. Unlike the Roman counterparts, who were largely confined to domestic roles, Celtic women stood on equal ground with men in many areas of life. A queen could rule as a sovereign, and her authority wasn't treated as an exception, but as an accepted part of cultural tradition. This was the world Boudica belonged to, a society where her rise as a wartime leader felt as natural as any king's. Tribal succession often followed maternal lines, emphasizing the importance of women not just as individuals, but as carriers of lineage and power. In times of war or crisis, women could step into roles that might otherwise have fallen to men. Many tribes regarded women as vessels of divine connection, their leadership reinforced by spiritual significance. This belief wasn't just ceremonial. Druidic tradition, which still thrived across Britain during Boudica's time, trained women to serve as seers, healers, and prophetesses. This gave them authority that went beyond politics. They played a role in shaping the spiritual morale of their communities. Boudica herself may have drawn upon these traditions as part of her leadership, blending cultural reverence with the practical demands of rebellion. Celtic women didn't stop at influencing politics or religion. They had tangible power in everyday life. They could own property independently and had the legal right to inherit land, an aspect completely foreign to Roman law, where women's rights were tightly restricted and often depended on male guardianship. Some women negotiated treaties or acted as judges within their tribes, further solidifying their integral role in maintaining social structures. In war, their status extended to the battlefield. Unlike Roman women, who were barred from military affairs, Celtic women could fight alongside men. In some tribes, young girls were trained to use weapons or ride war chariots, imbuing them with values of bravery from an early age. Boudica's rise to power makes sense in this cultural context. When her husband Prasutagus ruled, she had already been recognized as a co-ruler, not simply a ceremonial figure. After his death, her leadership in the rebellion didn't face internal opposition among the tribes. Instead, her authority grew, bolstered by her people's belief in her right to lead and their desperation to resist Roman domination. If anything, the collective fury following the Roman attacks on her family only solidified her position. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she embodied the rage of every Briton who had suffered under Rome's exploitation. The Romans, however, were stunned by a woman at the head of such a massive revolt. To them, leadership and warfare were strictly male domains. The idea of a female military leader commanding tens of thousands of warriors deeply unsettled them. Even accounts written by Roman historians at the time struggled to describe Boudica's authority without portraying it as unnatural. Tacitus and Cassius Dio both heavily criticized her defiance, attempting to paint her role as monstrous rather than legitimate. Yet these same accounts marveled at her ability to rally tribes that had once been divided, challenging the very foundation of Rome's colonial system. This contrast between Roman and Celtic gender roles exposed a significant cultural gap. The empire had spent decades underestimating the strength of tribal societies in Britain, assuming that their lack of Roman-style hierarchy made them weak. What they missed was that Celtic society allowed for a kind of flexibility that Rome couldn't understand. By allowing women to lead and fight, the Celts tapped into a broader pool of leadership and resilience, something Rome hadn't prepared for. Boudica was not a cultural anomaly. She was part of a long legacy of powerful women across the Celtic world, from the warrior queens of Iron Age Gaul to influential matriarchs in Ireland. Her story reminds us that power in Celtic Britain was never confined by the boundaries of gender, and that strength, especially in times of crisis, came from every member of their society. Boudica's rebellion wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a battle that seemed written into the stars, or so people believed at the time. As her uprising began to gain momentum, strange prophecies and omens spread like wildfire among the tribes of Britain. To many, these signs were undeniable proof that destiny was on their side. Roman historian Tacitus would later write of Druids and priestesses who claimed to have seen visions of Rome's downfall, a woman rising to burn the empire's grip to the ground. These predictions echoed through campfires and tribal assemblies, sowing hope among the Britons and unease among the Romans. It wasn't just the Iceni who believed Boudica's revolt was destined. The idea of a feminine force turning Rome's strength against itself was whispered as divine retribution. Even before the flames reached Londinium, Roman officials there reportedly experienced eerie forewarnings. Residents claimed to see phantom cities consumed in fire, bloody rivers flowing in the Thames, and ghostly voices crying out from the streets. These were likely dismissed as urban legends at first, mere superstition, but the terror they inspired only grew as the rebellion spread. In a culture as steeped in omens and portents as the Roman Empire, such rumors carried real weight. Many scholars believe that they would have shaken the confidence of Roman civilians and military leaders alike. After all, for the Romans, misinterpreting a sign from the gods could spell disaster, and Britannia now seemed to seethe with warnings flashing brighter than any torch. Among the Britons, these signs were less a warning and more a rallying cry. Many saw them as divine approval, a signal to fight for freedom from years of brutal foreign rule. Prophecies of a renewed native sovereignty had existed long before Boudica, but now people whispered that the time had come to fulfill them. Nature itself seemed to be participating in the revolt. Tribal warriors carried ravens and oak leaves into battle, sacred symbols of strength and endurance, while others marked their skin with runes said to channel the protection of the gods. Earthquakes shook the province, storms battered its coasts, and even these natural phenomena were quickly folded into the narrative. The land, many believed, was fighting Rome as fiercely as its people. On the Roman side, unease deepened as their own interpretations of the heavens shifted darkly. Soldiers spoke of failed auguries, where the sacred chickens used in Roman military rituals refused to eat, a classic bad sign in their culture. Others reported eclipses, strange weather, and animals giving birth to malformed offspring. While modern science sees these as natural occurrences, Roman soldiers wouldn't have been so practical. For them, every failed sign was evidence that they fought without divine favor. And in a far-flung, rebellious province marching under an unfamiliar sky, such doubts could take root frighteningly quickly. And yet, it wasn't just the supernatural imagery that gave Boudica's revolt its terrifying power. Her role as a chosen vessel of the gods added a layer of both mystery and urgency. Tribespeople claimed she didn't merely lead them, but channeled the words of ancient spirits in pre-battle speeches. Standing in her war chariot, with her daughters at her side, she embodied something greater than revenge. To her people, She was destiny personified, a queen turned avenger, wielding sacred fury against Rome's might. Boudica's followers harnessed these beliefs as psychological weapons. Prophecies didn't just reassure the Britons of their cause, they sowed discord among the Romans, who found themselves facing an enemy convinced their victory was divinely assured. In the days leading to the final confrontation, Roman troops discovered a chilling omen. A statue of Victory, goddess of triumph, had mysteriously fallen, an affront that no veteran commander could ignore. By the time swords were drawn, both sides stood convinced the gods had already decided the battle's outcome. Whether divine forces had any part to play or not, belief was a weapon sharper than steel. Boudica's revolt wasn't just a fight led by the Iceni. It grew into something far more dangerous for Rome, a unified rebellion involving tribes that had been at odds for generations. The Britons were fiercely independent, often clashing over territory, traditions, and even whose gods were most powerful. Rome exploited these rivalries, keeping tribes divided and easier to control. But under Boudica, centuries of tension within the islands began to dissolve. United hatred for Roman domination created bridges where once there had only been division. Her partnership with the Trinovantes was the first step. This tribe, based in southeast Britain, had perhaps suffered as much as the Iceni. Their lands had been seized for Roman settlements, sacred spaces demolished to make way for foreign gods, and their leaders stripped of status. Together, the Iceni and Trinovantes made up the backbone of Boudica's rebellion. Yet the uprising didn't stop with them. Tribes like the Cornovi and the Catuvellauni, even some thought to have been Roman allies, added their warriors to her growing force. Rome had failed to realize that its relentless systems of taxation and suppression had alienated almost everyone it ruled. What made Boudica's alliance remarkable was how she built it. She didn't demand loyalty. Instead, she traveled to tribal leaders as an equal. These leaders had seen Rome take her crown, beat her body, and desecrate her family. Now, here she was, not begging assistance, but offering a shared path to justice. Her story wasn't just personal. It became a story of what lay ahead for anyone who dared to resist Roman occupation. Those who initially doubted her cause saw her resolve and her vision. She didn't promise conquest, but the restoration of freedom, bringing back native laws and honoring the gods Rome had tried to erase. The idea of destroying Roman cities, wiping away their roads, and liberating sacred spaces from their temples ignited something powerful. Tribal leaders, once hesitant to risk their people, began pledging warriors, food supplies, and even their own sacred symbols. Boudica wasn't rallying an army through fear the way Rome maintained its legions. Instead, what she built reflected the shared grief and anger that had simmered since the Romans first landed. This was not a coalition for economic gain or territorial dominance. It was driven by revenge and the chance to reclaim a future untainted by imperial rule. Interestingly, the rebellion also attracted defectors, Romanized Britons who had adopted Roman customs, including those trained in Roman military tactics, left their settlements to join her. Some even made elaborate public displays of renouncing Roman life, burning tax records, and casting off their Roman attire. While these individuals might not have been many in number, their actions sent a clear message. The power of Rome was not absolute. A few symbolic acts could inspire many more to believe in their rebellion. In weeks, Boudica did what Rome had failed to achieve in decades of campaigns. She created a truly united force among tribes that, until then, had trusted no one but themselves. Her coalition was powerful not because of its size alone, but because it was built on a bond Rome could neither manipulate nor shatter. The shared fury and purpose of people who had faced betrayal after betrayal gave her something more enduring than gold or weapons: trust. And with trust came numbers. Farmers became soldiers, elders blessed the war effort, and Druids whispered prophecies of victory into the ears of warriors preparing for battle. Generations of mistrust between tribes began to crumble as leaders saw their fates reflected in Boudica's struggle. By the time her forces began their march, Boudica's movement had swelled to tens of thousands. It wasn't a trained army by Roman standards. It was something Rome couldn't understand. Every tribe, warrior, and symbol of resistance carried its own story into the fight, merging Boudica's rebellion into something greater than even she might have imagined. This wasn't just a queen leading her people. It was the soul of an entire land rising to confront an empire. With Boudica's rebellion surging across Roman Britain, chaos consumed the provinces as the Roman Empire found itself unable to manage the rapid and violent uprising. Stretched thin and facing overwhelming odds, military leaders had to make difficult and telling choices. Governor Suetonius, fresh from evacuating Londinium, chose to prioritize preserving troops and strategic military assets over defending the people Rome claimed to protect. His cold calculation left thousands of civilians behind, utterly exposed to the wrath of Boudica's advancing forces. Cities like Londinium, and shortly after Verulamium, became grim illustrations of this abandonment. Officials, soldiers, and key figures of Roman governance were evacuated first, often long before the full extent of the rebellion reached their gates. Civilians, however, shopkeepers, artisans, families, and the elderly, were left behind without protection. They were not only Roman-born citizens, but included Romanized Britons who had embraced Roman customs and built their lives around the promise that the empire would offer them stability and safety. These people, who had learned Roman ways and placed their trust in the strength of its legions, suddenly found themselves alone, vulnerable, and marked for destruction. When Boudica's armies reached these nearly defenseless settlements, they encountered little to no resistance. Roman citizens who had once dined in villas built over conquered tribal lands now faced the same relentless violence they had often ignored or dismissed. Entire communities were engulfed in fire and blood. Here, there would be no mercy. Some victims were set alight in their homes or shops, left to burn as Boudica's warriors moved from street to street. Others, captured alive, were executed on the spot or subjected to ritualistic killings performed within still-smoking temples, acts meant to deliver spiritual justice on behalf of the tribes. To Boudica's forces, these civilians were not simply innocent bystanders. They were collaborators in the very system that had oppressed their people. The settlers relied on lands stolen from the Iceni and Trinovantes. They paid their taxes into the Roman coffers that financed monuments like the Temple of Claudius. They built their lives on the ruins of tribal independence. Whether they had directly participated in the exploitation or merely benefited from it, they represented everything Boudica's revolt sought to overturn. Their deaths were not random. They were seen as retribution. Rome's abandonment of these people, however, left scars long after the fires died out. Suetonius, consumed with saving his forces for a final stand, never returned to recover the bodies or rebuild the devastated cities. Entire sections of Londinium and Verulamium remained in ash for years, silent reminders of how the empire had failed to defend the very citizens it was supposed to protect. Mass graves unearthed near Verulamium show hastily buried bodies, some likely thrown together in the aftermath of the massacre. Burn layers in the city's archaeological record offer chilling details of how rapidly it was consumed by the rebellion's fury. For the survivors, this betrayal shattered their faith in Roman authority. The empire had always promised strength, order, and protection, but Boudica's destruction revealed a stark reality. When the balance tipped against them, Rome would retreat without hesitation. This decision to leave civilians behind fractured Roman provincial society, deepening the divides between settlers and the soldiers who had abandoned them. This failure haunted Roman historical accounts of the revolt. While some writers glorified the eventual suppression of the rebellion, they could not ignore the empire's retreat and the horrific cost paid by the very people Rome claimed as its own. The screams from the burning cities, abandoned to their fate, echoed louder than any victory. For all its supposed might, the empire was not invincible, nor was it infallible. Sometimes, Rome's power simply ran and left its people to burn. One of the most remarkable elements of Boudica's campaign wasn't her ferocity alone. It was the way she turned Rome's own achievements against them. The Roman roads, the pride of imperial engineering, played a central role in her ability to strike swiftly and with devastating precision. These roads, designed to ensure Rome's control over its far-flung provinces, ended up being the perfect tools for rebellion. Built to move legions quickly, transport supplies, and connect key settlements, they became the very arteries through which Boudica's forces spread destruction. The better the roads, the faster her rebellion could travel. Key routes like Ermine Street and Watling Street became highways of ruin. Traditionally, these stone-paved roads symbolized Rome's civilization, cutting straight across the British landscape without concern for natural obstacles. Where muddy trails had once slowed movement for native tribes, the roads provided a direct path for Boudica's warriors to target Roman strongholds like Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. What previously would have taken weeks for a tribal army to march now took mere days, leaving Roman commanders scrambling to predict her next target. These roads, once a sign of Roman efficiency, were turned into a tool for sending their cities up in flames. Boudica wasn't improvising when she utilized the roads. This was a deliberate strategic choice that exposed a critical flaw in Rome's colonial strategy. The empire had designed systems to maintain control, assuming that the infrastructure would always serve their needs. What they hadn't anticipated was how easily those same systems could be repurposed in the hands of an enemy. By hijacking the roads, Boudica bypassed natural barriers like dense forests and rivers that might have delayed her forces. Scouts struggled to keep up with her movements, unable to pin down where the next strike would land. For Rome, efficiency quickly turned into vulnerability. Supply lines carefully maintained along these roads became easy targets for her allies, who ambushed caravans and cut off resource flow to Roman outposts. Messengers sent to request reinforcements often found their routes sabotaged or blocked, leaving legions isolated and slow to mobilize. Native tribes familiar with the terrain exploited every junction, forcing Roman troops to battle not just armies, but an increasingly fragmented and unpredictable web of disruptions. Despite its practical uses, the roads served more than just strategic purposes for Boudica's forces. They became symbols of Roman arrogance and control, reminders of how the empire imposed its will onto the landscape of Britain. Along some stretches of roads, tribal rebels reportedly chiseled away the Latin inscriptions on mile markers, replacing them with Druidic symbols. It was a defiant gesture, one that declared no matter how far the Roman network reached, it would never truly own the land. Way stations, built to house imperial officials and soldiers, were deliberately defaced or abandoned as Boudica's warriors advanced. The speed and coordination with which Britain fell into rebellion shocked Roman commanders. They had underestimated the ability of so-called barbarian forces to adapt to imperial systems. Roman generals, used to tribal warfare being chaotic and localized, were staggered by the way Boudica turned their very infrastructure into the backbone of her own campaign. Soldiers accustomed to marching swiftly toward their enemies found their own legions outpaced and outmaneuvered by the very roads they'd built. Boudica's use of Roman roads wasn't an accident, it was a masterstroke. She transformed Rome's greatest strength into an Achilles' heel, weaponizing the empire's own ambition against it. With each mile her army traveled, the roads carried not the might of Rome, but its undoing. Whether laden with the footsteps of warriors or marked with fire and ash, these roads became the pathways of devastation, dismantling imperial control piece by piece. While history often places Boudica at the forefront of the rebellion, the Druids acted as the rebellion's invisible backbone. These mysterious figures, deeply rooted in Celtic spirituality, wielded influence that stretched far beyond religious ceremonies. To the tribes of Britain, Druids were not just priests, they were lawmakers, healers, teachers, and political negotiators. Some ruled with authority that rivaled or even exceeded kings and queens, earning respect for their knowledge of law, nature, and ancient traditions. When Rome disrupted the delicate balance of tribal society, the Druids stepped into the chaos, uniting fractured groups under common causes. As Boudica's forces rallied, the Druids became indispensable to her mission. They weren't soldiers, but their contributions were no less vital. They used ancient rituals and sacred prophecies to frame the uprising as more than just an act of defiance. It was a holy war, sanctioned by their gods and the spirits of their ancestors. This belief galvanized the warriors, giving them the conviction that their cause was not only just, but inevitable. The Druids infused Boudica's rebellion with a spiritual weight that no Roman ritual could rival. They facilitated sacred oaths between tribes, ensuring alliances were forged with unbreakable bonds rooted in divine promises. Communication was another area where the Druids played a pivotal role. At the time, tribal rebellion might have seemed impossible to coordinate given the lack of written records or centralized leadership. Yet the Druids excelled at spreading plans and orders without leaving a trace for Roman spies to intercept. They relied on oral tradition and their expertise in symbols to carry messages across great distances. Their intimate knowledge of Britain's natural landscape allowed them to act as swift messengers and mediators between tribes. By using religious gatherings or ceremonies as a cover, they made movement between regions appear entirely innocent, evading Rome's watchful eyes. When the battles began, Druids didn't remain hidden in the shadows. Some joined Boudica's forces on the battlefield itself, their presence as much psychological as it was spiritual. They stood among the warriors, chanting prayers to invoke the blessings of tribal gods or calling down curses on the Roman legions. Their voices may have echoed like a force from another world, amplifying the tension as armies prepared to clash. Druids were also seen interpreting omens mid-battle, often pointing out movements in the clouds or sudden changes in the wind as signs of divine intervention. These practices solidified the belief that the gods were fighting with the Britons, making them seem unstoppable to their own side while unnerving their enemies. For the Romans, this influence was deeply unsettling. Roman writers often describe Druids with a mix of fascination and fear, painting them as dangerous zealots capable of stirring up the masses. Their authority over the Britons wasn't just spiritual, but also practical. They helped turn fragmented opposition into a single, coordinated force. It's no coincidence that shortly before Boudica's rebellion, Rome had already tried to crush the Druids' power. Governor Suetonius himself led a brutal campaign against a Druidic stronghold on the island of Anglesey, hoping to remove what he saw as the ideological heart of British resistance. Instead of silencing them, however, this attack may have inadvertently united the tribes further by providing a shared grievance. After Boudica's rebellion, Rome's fear of the Druids turned into outright suppression. Druidic practices were outlawed throughout the empire, and even the possession of certain sacred plants or objects associated with their rituals became forbidden. Yet the role during the revolt was unforgettable. The Druids were more than spiritual leaders. They were the architects of unity, the guardians of culture, and the ideological engine behind Boudica's war. Though their work often went unseen, it was their knowledge, influence, and beliefs that gave the rebellion its soul. After Camulodunum and Londinium had been reduced to ruins, Boudica's rebellion continued its relentless march, this time setting its sights on Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans. Unlike other cities, Verulamium was not a Roman settlement populated by veterans and officials, but rather by Romanized Britons. These were native people who had adopted the customs, laws, and lifestyle of their colonial rulers, ingratiating themselves into Rome's economic and administrative systems. To Boudica and her allies, this city represented a betrayal. It was a place where Britons lived by Roman laws, collected taxes for the empire, and embraced the Roman way of life, a stark contrast to the tribes who clung fiercely to their independence and traditions. For these reasons, Verulamium was no less a target than the fully Romanized Camulodunum or Londinium. If anything, its destruction carried an additional weight. Obliterating Verulamium wasn't just an act of physical conquest, it was a cultural reckoning. The tribal forces viewed Romanized Britons, despite their shared ancestry, as complicit in the oppression of their native lands. Rome had succeeded in fragmenting Britain by convincing many to side with the empire's order in exchange for security and the promise of wealth. When those promises were shattered, Verulamium stood as a glaring symbol of what the tribes sought to erase. Once again, Governor Suetonius Paulinus provided no defense. His strategy remained focused on assembling his forces and preparing for a decisive confrontation with Boudica, even if it meant abandoning yet another settlement. This left Verulamium equally vulnerable to the rebellion's wrath, a city vibrant with trade, temples, and marketplaces, but entirely unprepared for war. The people were left to defend themselves, but without trained soldiers or proper fortifications, they stood no chance against what was coming. Boudica's forces swept into the city with the same brutal efficiency that had already left two major Roman sites in ashes. Buildings were set alight, turning Verulamium's wooden structures into flames that roared high into the sky. The streets became rivers of smoke and carnage as warriors tore through the city, showing no distinction between Roman settlers and Romanized Britons. The residents who had thought their loyalty to Rome would protect them were proven devastatingly wrong. They, too, were slaughtered without mercy. Ancient accounts estimate that thousands perished during the destruction of Verulamium, though the exact numbers remain debated. The killing was accompanied by looting on an unprecedented scale. Wealthy inhabitants, accustomed to the privileges of Roman systems, had concealed their valuables in hopes of returning once the chaos abated. But Boudica's forces gave no quarter, tearing apart homes and temples in search of treasures before reducing them to rubble. Archaeologists have since uncovered evidence of hasty attempts to hide belongings, buried coin hoards and stashes of jewelry that were likely buried by fleeing elites who were either captured or never returned. The physical remains of Verulamium bear testimony to the totality of its destruction. Collapsed walls, charred timber, and melted artifacts show how thoroughly the city was dismantled. The ash layer beneath modern St. Albans tells a clear story of a city consumed in hours. Among the most striking finds are religious sites that collapsed under the flames, a stark reminder of how Boudica's rebellion targeted not just infrastructure, but symbols of Roman cultural and spiritual influence. For Boudica, The fall of Verulamium marked a crucial moment. It was her final citywide strike before the rebellion's eventual confrontation with Rome's remaining legions. With 3 Roman settlements completely annihilated in just 2 months, the rebellion had reshaped Britain's landscape. Verulamium's destruction was not just tactical, it was deeply symbolic, a cultural rejection of Romanization itself. By destroying a city full of native people who had embraced Roman identity, Boudica sent a clear message. There would be no middle ground in her fight. Rome, facing the bitter ruins of its urban ambitions, finally realized Boudica's rebellion wasn't simply a revolt or a single queen seeking revenge. It was a wholesale rejection of the empire's dominance, its systems, and its very right to rule. As Verulamium smoldered, the tribes had sent one last warning. The question now was whether Rome had the strength left to answer. As Boudica's rebellion swept through Roman Britain, it wasn't just cities that burned, it was the reputation of the Roman army itself. The 9th Legion, Legio Nonum Hispania, holds the grim distinction of being the first Roman legion to face Boudica, and the first to crumble. Commanded by Quintus Petilius Carialis, the 9th was tasked with intercepting the uprising before it gained further momentum. But this wasn't a routine skirmish. The legion's strength quickly turned to weakness as they underestimated the scope and fury of Boudica's forces. As the Roman infantry advanced, Boudica's warriors launched a surprise ambush, overwhelming the tightly organized Roman units with sheer numbers and rage. The Roman soldiers, known for their discipline and unbreakable formations, found their ranks torn apart. Chaos erupted. Their shields and armor offered little protection against the frenzied assaults of Boudica's army. While the Roman cavalry managed to escape the slaughter, the infantry wasn't as fortunate. Almost the entire ground force of the 9th was annihilated. It wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a massacre. Faced with this catastrophic loss, the remnants of Legio Nonum Hispania received strict orders: do not advance, retreat if necessary, avoid further losses at all costs. The battlefield humiliation turned into open fear, and the legion effectively withdrew from the campaign, refusing to re-engage with Boudica's unparalleled tribal force. From a Roman perspective, this was no ordinary hesitation. Legions were expected to fight to the death. Retreat was seen as dishonor, hesitation as betrayal. This failure wasn't officially erased in the moment, but whispers of embarrassment spread quickly, enough for later Roman accounts to conveniently lose track of the 9th Legion's fate entirely. Some historians argue that this moment marked the beginning of a deeper erosion of the Legion's reputation, and its later disappearance remains one of Roman military history's most haunting mysteries. Choosing not to re-engage may have preserved the lives of some Roman soldiers, but it spelled disaster for others. With no reinforcements coming, the wealthiest cities under Roman control, Londinium, Camulodunum, and Verulamium, were abandoned to their destruction. Roman citizens, settlers, and Romanized Britons alike were left to fend for themselves. The 9th's withdrawal effectively handed these undefended cities over to Boudica's advancing forces, a decision that bruised the empire's ego even more than it emptied its treasury. The transformation of the 9th Legion into an absent and inactive force fueled the perception that Boudica's army was more than just a rebellious band of tribespeople. Romans who witnessed, or survived, the revolt began to believe that her forces were divinely protected or inspired by otherworldly powers. Superstition crept into Roman morale, turning fear into paralysis. It's one thing to die for the empire. It's another to face an enemy your gods might not be able to conquer. This psychological shift, planted during the 9th's defeat, grew into a far-reaching shadow over Roman confidence in the provinces. Governor Suetonius Paulinus now faced an almost insurmountable challenge. With fewer than 10,000 men at his command, it was up to him to somehow stop a tribal force likely exceeding 100,000. And those odds were made possible in part by the mere absence of the ninth. The Empire's most celebrated military machine, known as an unyielding force across the known world, had revealed a crack, and Boudica exploited it, both strategically and symbolically. In war, perception matters. By avoiding the battlefield, the 9th Legion sent a signal to all of Britain's tribes. If Rome's soldiers wouldn't stand and fight, maybe the Empire wasn't as undefeatable as it claimed. The fall of 3 cities and a fractured Roman army left Governor Suetonius Paulinus with no room for error. The rebellion led by Boudica had grown into a tidal wave, overwhelming entire regions and shaking Roman control to its core. But Suetonius, a seasoned military commander, knew that if Rome had any chance of surviving in Britain, it would be decided not in the towns, but on the battlefield. He carefully selected his ground, a narrow stretch along Watling Street, surrounded by dense forest and flanked by terrain that would funnel Boudica's massive force into a choke point. Suetonius faced staggering odds, commanding barely 10,000 Roman soldiers against an estimated 100,000 tribal warriors, if not more. Boudica had united a fierce coalition of tribes, and their sheer numbers seemed like a guaranteed path to victory. But numbers alone couldn't decide this fight. Suetonius had a different strategy in mind, one that relied not on overwhelming force, but on discipline, precision, and the unforgiving constraints of geography. The narrow valley meant that Boudica's army, despite its size, couldn't effectively deploy. Instead of surrounding the Roman forces, they'd be forced to advance head-on, funneling into a tightening gap the closer they came to Suetonius's lines. The Roman soldiers were arranged in the classic wedge formation, shields locked tightly, with spearmen positioned to exploit every weakness in the enemy's advance. Behind them, artillery units stood ready, ballistas, catapults, and archers prepared to rain destruction on the approaching warriors. Suetonius made his position clear. There would be no retreat. The soldiers were pinned between the terrain and their enemies, with no alternative but to fight to the last man. For the Romans, the stakes were existential. For the Britons, it was a fight they believed would end Roman occupation forever. Boudica, confident in the overwhelming size of her forces, added a fateful twist to the battle preparations. Wagons filled with women, children, and elderly from the tribal communities were placed at the rear of her army. They had been brought to witness Rome's defeat, to see with their own eyes the final collapse of the empire that had oppressed their people. But as the first wave hit the Roman lines, it became clear that the battle would not go as Boudica had hoped. The Britons surged forward in great numbers, but the narrow battlefield forced them into a bottleneck. Unable to spread out, they lost their advantage of mobility and became easy targets for the highly trained Roman troops. Suetonius's soldiers hurled pila javelins into the advancing warriors, cutting down entire ranks before they even reached the Roman shields. When the warriors slammed into the Roman front line, they met a wall of armor and discipline, with spears darting through gaps in the formation. The initial momentum of the Britons faltered, and chaos began to ripple backward through their ranks. Behind them, the wagons turned from a symbol of triumph into a fatal barrier. When the Britons attempted to fall back, they found their retreat blocked by the very observers who had come to celebrate victory. Panic spread as the wounds inflicted by Roman pila, artillery fire, and organized charges tore through the already disorganized forces. The battle devolved into a rout as the Britons, trapped between the Romans and their own rear guard, were cut down in staggering numbers. Ancient sources claim as many as 80,000 tribal warriors may have lost their lives in just the span of a few hours. Interestingly, some historians suggest Suetonius may have hidden a detachment of elite archers in the surrounding tree line to amplify his advantage. As the Britons broke apart, these archers could have loosed a devastating volley onto the tightly packed warriors, initiating the final collapse of their formation. While this detail remains debated, it highlights the ingenuity of Roman tactics, which prioritized methodical devastation over chaotic skirmishes. In the end, Suetonius demonstrated that terrain could decide battles just as effectively as numbers. The disciplined ranks of his soldiers turned a hopeless scenario into one of Rome's most decisive victories in Britain. But the cost of the rebellion and the scars it left on both sides would linger far longer than any battlefield glory. Boudica's defeat at Watling Street wasn't the result of sheer determination or bravery on Rome's part. It was a methodical trap designed with a single purpose: to dismantle her overwhelming army through strategy, not brute force. Suetonius Paulinus knew he couldn't meet the Britons head-on in open terrain. Outnumbered 10-1, he instead chose the location carefully, an unremarkable stretch of Watling Street bordered by dense forests on both sides, narrowing into a tight funnel. Behind the chosen site loomed a steep incline, which protected the Roman rear and ensured there would be no flanking attacks. It was the perfect place for a smaller, disciplined army to hold its ground. And it was a place where size, for once, worked against Boudica's forces. The tribes swept forward with the confidence of victory behind them, emboldened by their string of successful raids. They believed Rome was retreating, or perhaps on the verge of collapse altogether. Recon was overlooked, and Boudica's warriors surged straight into the bottleneck. Packed too tightly to maneuver, or adjust once the battle began, they unknowingly sealed their fate. Suetonius had arranged his 10,000 men in a triple-line formation, a hallmark of Roman discipline. The front ranks, armed with pila, started the attack by launching a continuous barrage of javelins into the approaching Britons. Each wave weakened the tribal force before they could so much as touch a Roman shield. And as casualties mounted in the front ranks, more warriors surged forward to fill the gaps, creating chaos and pushing them even deeper into the choke point. Meanwhile, behind Boudica's main army, chaos quietly festered. Seeking to underscore their impending triumph, the tribes had brought wagons filled with non-combatants, families, elders, and children, all stationed at the rear of the battlefield. What initially symbolized the unity and pride of the tribes quickly became their greatest liability. As the first waves of the advance faltered under Roman javelins and close combat precision, the warriors tried to retreat. But there was nowhere to go. The wagons formed a solid barricade behind them, trapping those in the center and creating a fatal stampede as panic rippled backward through Boudica's ranks. When the tribe's initial charge began to falter, the Romans pressed their advantage. Suetonius unleashed his cavalry on the flanks, giving the battle a new level of brutality. The horsemen swept in from both sides, cutting down warriors who had no room to defend themselves. Any fragmented attempts at reorganizing the tribal force were crushed by the combination of Roman spears, swords, and cavalry. The bottleneck had turned into a graveyard, as warriors were slaughtered faster than they could retreat. The location's narrowness intensified the disaster. With tribes packed into a shrinking space, many warriors had no choice but to climb over the bodies of the dead and wounded, making them easy prey for Roman soldiers who kept their formation strong throughout the battle. It wasn't simply a case of the Roman army outclassing their opponents. The terrain had done much of the work for them, ensuring that an overwhelming force became an overwhelming liability. What made Boudica's army nearly unstoppable in urban raids, their sheer numbers, proved catastrophic in this confined killing zone. Even as the battle's outcome became clear, retreat was impossible. By the end of the bloodbath, as many as 80,000 Britons were dead. Entire family lines were extinguished in the chaos, and the wagons that were meant to symbolize pride became suffocating prisons. Roman losses, by comparison, were astonishingly low. Accounts suggest that just a few hundred soldiers fell in that day. And though the exact site of the battle remains disputed, archaeological findings in likely locations show evidence of mass cremations and hurriedly buried remains, a grim testimony to the scale of the destruction. Watling Street was less of a battle and more of a calculated slaughter. It was a place where Roman cunning overcame every numerical disadvantage. Boudica wasn't defeated because she lacked bravery or determination. She was defeated because Rome forced her to fight in a space where her army's greatest strength couldn't save her. After the devastating defeat at Watling Street, Boudica disappeared from both the battlefield and the pages of history. No Roman source recorded what became of her after the battle. There were no triumphal parades showcasing her capture, no public displays of her downfall, a glaring absence for an empire that glorified the humiliation of its enemies. Tacitus, one of the few ancient historians to provide an account, wrote that she took poison rather than fall into Roman hands. Another Roman historian, Cassius Dio, vaguely mentions that she fell ill and died, though his account is steeped in dramatics that cast doubt on its accuracy. These claims, sparse and unverified, have left her final moments shrouded in mystery. Physical evidence of Boudica's fate is non-existent. Archaeologists have found no gravesite, no remains, nothing to link her to a definite location. Some scholars argue that her people may have taken her body far from Roman reach, possibly to a sacred site where she could receive a burial befitting a queen, a secret resting place lost to time. This absence of evidence has only fueled speculation throughout the centuries, with theories ranging from deliberate concealment by her tribe to outright destruction of records by the Romans to erase her memory. What is clear, however, is what followed her disappearance. With Boudica's army shattered and her tribal alliance in ruins, Rome wasted no time in asserting iron-fisted control once more. Suetonius Paulinus, emboldened by his victory, embarked on a ruthless campaign of reprisals. Villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were razed. Rebels, real or imagined, were executed in droves. Survivors were beaten down into submission, ensuring no one could rise again to challenge the empire in such numbers. Yet even as Rome reasserted its grip over Britain, Boudica's rebellion had forced the empire to confront a chilling prospect. Its rule in Britain was no longer guaranteed. The depth of the rebellion's impact wasn't lost on Emperor Nero. Letters flooded back to Rome, painting a vivid picture of the chaos that had consumed the province. Some reports suggested that Nero seriously considered abandoning Britain altogether, cutting losses and retreating from the troubled territory. It was only through the advice of his inner circle, warning of the humiliation and political consequences of such a retreat, that Nero reluctantly held on to the province. Even in her defeat, Boudica had come closer than anyone to toppling Rome's hold on Britain entirely. But if Boudica's rebellion accomplished anything, it was showing Rome the cost of underestimating her. Unlike other defeated enemies, Boudica wasn't taken as a prisoner to march in chains through the streets of Rome. She wasn't immortalized in sculptures of defeat or vilified in victory monuments. In fact, she was left as a ghost in the Roman imagination, an unacknowledged figure too dangerous to glorify, even in defeat. To parade Boudica as a beaten foe would risk making her a martyr. Silence, for Rome, was a safer weapon. Legends about her continued to grow, and while the truth of her death remains elusive, lore sprang up around her resting place. Some claim she lies beneath the modern-day platform 8, 9, or 10 at King's Cross Station in London, making a humble train hub an unlikely shrine to her memory. While this tale lacks any basis in archaeological fact, its endurance speaks to how Boudica's story continues to capture imaginations. Her disappearance wasn't the end of her impact. Instead, it transformed her from a rebel queen to a timeless symbol. Boudica became an icon of defiance, a reminder that resistance, even against insurmountable odds, could shake the foundations of an empire. Boudica's revolt may have ended in military defeat, but its influence has endured far longer than the battlefields it scorched. Her rebellion forced Rome, and every empire since, to confront an uncomfortable truth. No amount of military power or territorial control can protect an empire from the wrath of those it seeks to subdue. Boudica exposed the cracks in Rome's seemingly immovable foundation. Her uprising demonstrated that every empire, no matter how vast or disciplined, relies as much on the loyalty and compliance of its subjects as on its armies or infrastructure. For Rome, the rebellion shattered a carefully cultivated image of invincibility. Boudica had done what was previously unthinkable. She burned cities, annihilated armies, and mocked the very symbols of Roman superiority, all while leading a coalition often dismissed as barbarians. These actions didn't just humiliate the empire on a logistical level, they tore apart its psychological dominance. To the Romans, their governance and their military existed as an unchallengeable force. Boudica reduced that myth to ash alongside Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. Her revolt became a warning for every empire after Rome. Boudica showed that enforcing power through violence and subjugation creates fractures. The garrison towns, temples, and roads that symbolized Roman order were meaningless when trust and cultural understanding were absent. Seen through a modern lens, historians frequently use her story to illustrate the dangers of imperial arrogance. Empires that fail to address resentment among their conquered peoples often find themselves blindsided by rebellion, led not by overwhelming weapons or armies, but by the will of the oppressed. Even more than the destruction her forces unleashed, it's Boudica's identity that makes her so enduring. She wasn't a shadowy figure rallying forces from behind the scenes. She stood at the forefront of the fight. In an overwhelmingly patriarchal world, she emerged as a leader commanding a force capable of nearly driving Rome out of Britain. For women across history, her rebellion resonates as an act of defiance against a system that sought to silence and diminish her. She remains a figure of empowerment for those who see in her refusal to surrender an example of resilience at any cost. Boudica's presence isn't confined to ancient history. Political movements across the centuries have invoked her name when confronting oppression. She has been hailed as an example of leadership in resistance not only by historians, but by political thinkers analyzing anti-colonial struggles and insurgencies. During World War II, Winston Churchill called upon her legacy as a symbol of courage and national defiance against the looming threat of Nazi invasion, framing Britain's resistance as a continuation of Boudica's fight. Her story has been recast in countless ways, by revolutionaries seeking inspiration, feminists reclaiming her strength, and even monarchs seeking ties to her enduring legend. What makes Boudica so terrifying to empires isn't just her ability to destroy, but the fact that she cannot be truly erased. Rome tried to suppress her memory, omitting her sacrifice from its usual triumphs. Instead, she became a symbol, universal and timeless. Her legacy persistently reemerges whenever questions of freedom and domination are raised. Every empire fears the figures who survive not through victory, but through memory. Those whose stories, born of rage and resistance, linger longer than the systems they sought to overthrow. Today, she endures not as a tragic queen, but as a lesson for the ages. Empires are strongest when they're unchallenged. But once an unrelenting force rises from an unexpected leader or an overlooked people, even the mightiest empire can be brought to its knees. Boudica stands as proof that sometimes the loudest scream comes from those who've been pushed into silence for far too long. Boudica proved that even the greatest empires can fall when built on injustice. She turned pain into power and became a symbol of resistance. Like Untold Stories of Power and Rebellion? Subscribe for more.